I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.
Of all the Fallout games, I've only ever played Fallout Shelter, due to certain circumstances preventing me from enjoying the other games. Therefore, I know none of the lore. But thanks to getting my vault completely obliterated multiple times from Dusclaws and Rat Scorpions, or just me forgetting to log out, which happens way too often, I got to familiarize myself with the Fallout universe somehow, thus leading me to learn of the existence of Radaways. So imagine my surprise when I found out that there actually exists something similar to Radaways, which would be radiation pills. Now, I hate history and find it pointless to document scenes that will eventually either turn to dust or be lost to eternity. But still, we're gonna need to know a brief bit of history before we proceed. I guess not need, but nah, forget it, let's just start. March 12th, 1947, the Cold War begins, leading to the first documented period in history where two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, possessed large arsenals of nuclear weapons. Not exactly a great outlook for humanity. With World War II being the debut of nuclear weapons and demonstrating just how destructive they are, both sides were well aware of the destructive power they possessed, and knew that if either side started using nukes, it would result in mutually assured destruction, thus creating a stalemate in regards to nuclear weapons. However, that didn't stop the looming threat of nuclear war. Humans can't be trusted with weapons of mass destruction after all. Since of course we went on to make an even more devastating hydrogen bomb for some reason, which is another story for another time. But like the saying goes, don't corner a rat or it'll fight back. If one side becomes desperate enough, their rationality will lose to that desperation. And with a few simple actions, nuclear war begins, leading to a heightened fear of nuclear warfare. So sometime in the 1950s, scientists determined that potassium iodide, which is the ionized form of iodine, was the most effective preventative measure against radiation, which if you'll notice, ionizing iodine turns an N into a D, resulting in iodide. I don't get it either, but I guess all words are just made up words anyways. But as I was saying, it was a preventative measure that specifically protected your thyroid from radiation, and even more specifically protecting your thyroid from only one type of radiation, that being radioactive iodine. Now, as for how it works, well, first we have radioactive iodine, which is a form of internal contamination infiltrating your system, which is much worse than external contamination. Then we have the defender, potassium iodide, whose chemical formula is Ki, and is also the stable non-radioactive iodine. Next thing to know is that your thyroid is a gland in your neck, which naturally absorbs iodine because it needs iodine to produce thyroid hormones. However, it indiscriminately absorbs any type of iodine, be it potassium iodide or radioactive iodine. It doesn't give a shit if it absorbs something that's going to increase your chances of developing thyroid cancer. All your thyroid cares about is doing its job by producing more hormones. So now we have both radioactive iodine and potassium iodide, and your thyroid can't tell the difference between the two. So the way potassium iodide works as a protective measure is quite simple. Your thyroid does have a maximum capacity to how much iodine it can absorb. So why not saturate it with the healthier and not radioactive potassium iodide, and make sure your thyroid is too full to absorb any of the radioactive iodine. In short, charging your thyroid to maximum capacity with the healthier iodine in order to deflect the radiation. So for Ki to be most effective, you must take it before or shortly after being exposed to radioactive iodine to saturate your thyroid as soon as possible and prevent the radiation from accumulating in your thyroid. And your thyroid usually stays saturated for the next 24 hours, with biological variances always being a possibility, of course. Also, as a side note, if you thought about iodized salt or iodized foods, then good on you for making that connection. But unfortunately those can't be used as a substitute for Ki. While they are indeed rich in iodide, they're not nearly high enough in concentration to block radioactive iodine from getting into your thyroid gland. I mean, in theory, you could eat iodized foods as an alternative, but you'd need to consume an unwieldy amount of food to the point of impracticality. It's much easier to just consume a small 135 milligram tablet. But to give you a point of reference, potassium iodide is a 1-to-1 ratio of potassium and iodine. Iodine is like 70% of it in weight, while iodized salt contains about 50 micrograms of iodine per gram, and 1 gram is a million micrograms. So if I'm not mistaken, it means iodized salt is 0.005% iodide. And considering that standard Ki tablets are 135 milligrams, which is about 135,000 micrograms, so you would need to ingest 2,700 grams of iodized salt to match one measly 135 milligram Ki tablet. So about 6 pounds of salt. I can feel my mouth shriveling up just from imagining the horror of eating 6 pounds of salt. You'd probably end up getting salt poisoning, if not definitely. But back to where I left off. Potassium iodide is an 100% protection. Nothing is ever a perfect 100% guarantee, but it's the best thing you've got to protect yourself against one extremely specific type of radiation. As far as I know, there's no treatment to reverse damage that's already been done. At least not yet. And as you've probably guessed by now, it really doesn't help much with nuclear fallout and its abundance of radioactive materials. Ki only protects the thyroid after breathing, eating, or drinking something containing only radioactive iodine. There's a tiny amount of radioactive iodine in nuclear fallout compared to the bajillion other forms of radiation destroying your DNA. And personally, I think that if you're in a situation where you've been exposed to enough radioactive iodine to warrant the usage of Ki tablets, then you've pretty much already experienced half-life, as in your lifespan being instantly cut in half. By then, you've probably been exposed to a beyond lethal level of both external and internal contamination. However, Ki tablets should be useful near the outskirts of the blast radius. The further you are from ground zero, the more effective the tablet should be. It's a bit of a complex mess since nuclear fallout has stages to it, where certain types of radiation are more concentrated. Radioactive iodine is usually in the early stages of a nuclear fallout since its half-life is only a few days long. It hits you aggressively fast, but retreats just as quickly, while other isotopes last longer and are more gradual in their progression. As for the amount of radiation absorbed by the rest of your body, well, that's only usually slightly more than the natural background radiation we already receive on a daily basis. And as usual, here's a bit of additional info nobody asked for, but I'm inserting anyways because why not? It's only really recommended that you take Ki tablets if you're under the age of 40, since by the time you reach the age of 40, the cell division and metabolism of your thyroid will have slowed down enough to make radioactive iodine less of a threat. Since due to getting old, everything slows down, including the rate you absorb iodine. Also, the slower cell division means a lower chance of DNA being damaged. Yeah, in hindsight, radiation pills weren't really useful. It was more so the government's attempt to ease the minds of the public. It's like those duck and cover drills, where you try to make the children feel like the adults have a control of the situation and have a countermeasure against it. Just as how the government knew that potassium iodide tablets would be a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the god knows how many types of radiation in nukes, schools knew full well that hiding under that flimsy desk of yours may protect you from chunks of debris, but it would do nothing against a solid ton of concrete falling on top of you. So yeah, the government started distributing radiation pills and it kind of worked. I mean, compared to the current government that's just treading water, I see that as a win. Also, another fun fact is that radioactive iodine can actually be used to treat hyperthyroidism. I refuse to elaborate more on the details because I don't feel like it. And people with iodine sensitivity shouldn't take iodine for obvious reasons. In short, pretty simple, right? Now for some FDA stuff on when to take it. For children from 1 month to 18 years old, your predicted thyroid exposure is more than or equal to 5 milligrams of radiation. Predicted thyroid exposure is essentially just what the radiation threshold is for you to start taking the tablets. So in this case, if you're in an environment where you're predicted to be exposed to 5 or more milligrays of radiation, then it's necessary to take the tablets to protect your thyroid. Of course, if you happen to weigh over 150 pounds, then you would take an adult dosage. You chubby little American fat ass. And if you're over the age of 40, then the predicted exposure is 500 milligrays. So basically you can tolerate 100 times more radiation exposure before it threatens damage to your thyroid. You don't even need to worry about thyroid cancer, because at this point, it's almost impossible for you to get it due to how old and decrepit your body is becoming. Of course, in exchange for the equivalent of immunity to thyroid cancer, you get an increased risk of developing other health issues with your thyroid. But hey, at least it isn't cancer. Also, pregnancy and lactation leads to a predicted exposure of 5 milligrays or more because of children. So there's that. Anyways, that's potassium iodide for you. Of course, all this doesn't mean that only one type of radiation is treatable. While I may have titled a video as radiation pills, in this context, radiation pills are really only just potassium iodide because Cold War and stuff. It's more relevant to the Fallout connection I was trying to force. You know, if I'm being honest, this whole dive into radiation pills turned out to be pretty disappointing. It's nowhere near enough to satisfy my fantasies about a post-apocalyptic nuclear fallout world. So to compensate for my crushing disappointment, I'll talk about other types of stuff you can consume for other types of radiation. The first of which being Prussian blue, or radiogardas. Otherwise known as iron 3 hexacyanoferrate 2. I hate English. Radiogardase. Now that's something that sounds like it fits right into the Fallout universe. Anyways, Prussian blue is also good for treating internal contamination, mostly due to its unique ability to bind to certain radioactive materials such as radioactive cesium or CS-137 and thallium. Oh yeah, and the chemical formula for Prussian blue is this mess. I failed organic chem, so I don't know how to say it with all the brackets and number scenes. But once you intake Prussian blue as a capsule of some sort, it binds to cesium or thallium ions in the gastrointestinal tract, aka your meters of shit tubes, which prevents them from being absorbed into the bloodstream, where it would give you irradiated blood, which would not give you Spidey powers. But thanks to Prussian blue binding to the radioactive ions, they don't get absorbed into your body by clinging to tissues or organs your bloodstream may have carried them by. So now the bonded ions can be safely shot out of your system. Now, as for how it works, in scientific terms, it's due to Prussian blue's unique chemical structure and ion exchanging properties. Specifically, its cube lattice structure formed by iron ions connected by cyanide groups. That creates a network of tiny channels and cavities within the crystal lattice. And that lattice has a negative charge, so it attracts and binds positively charged ions or cations, which is what cesium and thallium are. And since cesium and thallium have similar ionic radii, they get drawn in by the lattice and locked into place. Sounds really complicated with all the scientific jargon, huh? But have no fear, for I am no stranger to the hardships of being stupid. So, after a mind-numbing amount of time spent trying to interpret what all this means, I can finally translate it into something both you and I can understand. Basically, magnetic puzzle pieces. Cesium and thallium are just puzzle pieces that fit in quite snugly in the holes of the lattice structure, since a lattice is really just a net or chain-linked fence. And since negative ions attract positive ions, the puzzle pieces naturally guide themselves into place and then get locked in. It's like a sticky ball you just roll to pick up the radiation. Oh right, and while cyanide is a poison, in Prussian blue the cyanide is bound really firmly to the iron ions, making it non-toxic under normal conditions, with normal conditions mean anything that doesn't break the connection between them. So the cyanide groups can't release the toxic cyanide ions that usually drift around your body and wreak havoc. Then there's other stuff like DTPA, which is diethylene triamine pentaacetate, which comes in two forms, calcium DTPA or Ca-DTPA and zinc DTPA, aka ZN-DTPA. According to Google and some science websites, DTPA is a chelating agent for internal radiation. specifically against transuranic elements like plutonium, americium, and curium, binding to radioactive materials in the body, forming stable complexes that can be excreted through urine. None of which are words I understood, but from what I've deduced, it's good for treating internal contamination caused by plutonium, americium, and curium, because apparently DTPA has a high affinity for heavy metals, specifically stuff in the actinides row of the periodic table, which, if you'll notice, contains all three. Additionally, DTPA seems to have a nice affinity with high charge density stuff, so elements or heavy metals, I'm not really sure which, with a charge of like +3 or +4 is great stuff, while cesium and thallium, which are also heavy metals, have a lesser charge of +1, so menos bueno. Take all the stuff as a grain of sand. Forget organic chem, I barely passed any of my chemistry classes. That being said, let's continue reciting scientific jargon I don't understand. DTPA is an organic molecule with binding sites called ligands that attach to metal ions central diacylene triamine backbone with 5 carboxylate groups attached. The carboxylate groups are negatively charged. Positives and negatives, yeah. God, I feel like I'm sinning against science. But onwards, there was a whole essay of scientific jargon I had to comb through to try and figure out why DTPA is so good at binding to actinides. There were multiple reasons at play, but it turns out all of them are just due to its chemical structure. That's literally it. Jesus, I hate the scientific community sometimes. But now that I actually understood some of it, DTPA itself is a synthetic molecule that doesn't naturally exist. It still has side effects since it was designed to bind to metal ions, and your body has other stuff that inevitably gets binded. So ideally a more fine-tuned chemical structure will lead to less side effects since it will be more targeted. And I guess it's pretty much just the same premise as Prussian blue, which is also synthetic, except DTPA is more optimized for certain types of ions. Took me way too long to figure all this out. God, I'm slow. I'll also have to revise some things, I guess, since both Prussian blue and DTPA are reliant on their chemical structures when it comes to removing radiation. However, the way they go about using their chemical structure is different. Prussian blue, as discussed earlier, has a cube lattice structure, which is essentially just a cage that traps radioactive ions in the lattices. Think of it like when you hit a tennis ball too hard and it gets lodged into the chain-linked fence. Meanwhile, DTPA is pretty much just a claw machine that grabs ions and holds onto them. I still don't quite understand how that works. I couldn't find a visualization of the molecular structure. But basically, Prussian blue passively rolls on through your body, while DTPA actively seeks out radiation it can snatch. Also, as a fun tidbit, Prussian blue wasn't initially synthesized for treating internal contamination. It was actually created to serve as a blue pigment for paints and dyes, which in hindsight should have been obvious given the context of it literally being named blue. Also, like most human creations, it was on accident. Some guy tried to make red and ended up with blue. So, yeah, there's that. Also, DTPA is administered directly into your bloodstream, so usually through an IV drip bag. It does the binding in your bloodstream, forming a stable water-soluble complex or something. Then your kidneys filter that and then you piss it out. But anyways, I'm sure you're wondering why there's ZN-DTPA and Ca-DTPA. Interestingly enough, zinc and calcium aren't actually necessary for the removal of internal contamination. Zinc and calcium are pre-binded or pre-bonded, I don't know the proper term, as preventative measures since they both are metal ions. By making sure they're already binded to the DTPA, we can minimize the amount of zinc and calcium they bind to within your body, therefore preventing the DTPA from depleting those essential metals in your body. DTPA itself isn't a preventative measure, it's just a treatment method for speeding up the process of removing the radiation, with the calcium form being more effective when taken within the first day of contamination, and after 24 hours, they're pretty much equally effective. Of course, you still might want to choose carefully depending on if you have a calcium or zinc deficiency. Zinc is generally less effective, but it is useful for long-term treatment since it's less likely to result in side effects from mineral depletion. Oh, and you might also remember that DTPA is effective against plutonium. And you know what else used plutonium? The Demon Core. So would DTPA have been useful against the Demon Core? No. It only treats internal radiation, not the skin-burning amount of external radiation the Demon Core would have emitted. But speaking of calcium and zinc and calcium themselves can also be used as a preventative measure to reduce radiation absorption, specifically radioactive strontium or SR90. It basically functions the same way potassium iodide does. Calcium and zinc compete with strontium to see who gets absorbed into your bones or tissues first. Or rather, your body will prefer to absorb calcium over strontium as long as your body receives a healthy supply of calcium. As for zinc, well, it's kind of that gray area where there's some evidence that zinc helps prevent strontium radiation from being absorbed, but nobody knows how or why exactly it helps. That's about it. Just consume stuff with lots of zinc and calcium. And guess what's rich in both zinc and calcium? Milk. So if you're lactose intolerant, well then, I guess you'll die. Or you could just consume other stuff rich in zinc or calcium, like supplements. Also, upon further investigation, turns out cesium-137, some forms of strontium, and radioactive iodine are all fairly common components of nuclear fallout. So that's pretty cool. You can just take a mixture of those things according to the stages of fallout. I think plutonium is also used in nukes. I don't know which types though. Who cares anyways? And it goes without saying that every one of these things can result in overdoses, with varying degrees of consequences. Of course, worst case scenario for all of them is death. You just need to overdose by a lot. Then again, you can't technically overdose on everything. Like, water is just internal drowning, or oxygen poisoning, maybe even a food coma or obesity-related death. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think my dwellers are dying again.
I've lost all ambition or worldly acclaim. I just wanna be the one you love. And with your admission that you feel the same, I'll have reached the goal I'm dreaming of. Believe me, I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.